Hi, and welcome to the Politics of Justice. It's me, Amy Austin. So, where we left off last time was at the end of chapter 14 of Ransomed. And okay, so the last time I recorded, I mentioned the Casey Cort origin story. Does she have a multiverse? Do I have a multiverse? I have to think about that. Okay, anyway, so the book that's her origin story is Disgraced, which is right here. And then the book I'm dealing with today is Ransom. Look at me. I got the right books out and everything. Super proud of myself. So let's get back to it. So when I'm going to start with chapter 15, and it's a Claire chapter. The date is November 15, 2023. And in this chapter, we start with Claire. And oh boy. Okay. So it's Claire and Miles are together. And Miles's first question is, why did you report a gun? So it's at that point we find out that the way that she got the police to her house so quickly is that she reported that Darius, her baby daddy, had a gun. I will only say this in every place I've ever lived, the police are slow to respond slow to respond to personal calls unless the person indicates that there's a gun involved. It seems they respond in LA to, like, car theft more than anything else. I mean, literally somebody got shot, like, not too far from me, probably, like, a mile away, which is not great, recently, and there was a response for that, but I've, like, seen, like, a huge outside response for, like, a stolen vehicle, which is just property. But when it comes to crimes against people, a little slow on the response. There's even a person running for mayor who's like, "When you call 911 if I'm mayor, somebody's gonna answer the phone." I was like, "Probably not gonna vote for you, but that's a laudable goal." Okay, completely sidetracked. So when Claire tells Miles that the way that she got to the police to respond was by saying that Darius had a gun, even though he didn't have it, Miles is pretty disgusted. I'm just going to speak for him. It's a Claire chapter, but he acts pretty disgusted. And they're at this restaurant eating. It's called the Inn on Coventry, which I think, well, it used to exist. I have no idea what exists in Cleveland anymore. But he if you don't recall, like, previously, he tried to break up with her. He's tried a couple times, we need to break up, but he didn't leave the door open, he was just like, "You can call me anytime," and I think that Claire is struggling with that, because after they have this whole conversation about calling the cops, saying there was a gun, saying that that wasn't true, but she really wanted Darius out, 'cause she didn't want it to escalate to any kind of violence, where her son was present. Miles is like, "Peace out," right? And Claire is like, Let's go Christmas shopping." And, the highlight is Miles looked around as if excuses were as prevalent as sugar packets in this diner. "Isn't it a little early?" he finally settled on. I gestured out the window. Cleveland had latched onto the holiday season like a drowning man would to grab a lifeline. Twinkling lights, faux trees, and heaps of shopping opportunities were everywhere. So she's like, "No, I wanna, like, go shopping for Luke. I wanna get him something special, his dad's in, like, county lockup. Let's do this." And Miles is like, "No, I don't think it's a good idea." And let me say this. Okay, so there was a recent, season of Love Is Blind where this half Black, half Colombian woman whose name was Brittany. And the thing, she was with this guy named Devontae, which we're not even gonna get into his whole thing. He didn't like her. It was clear he didn't like her. The last conversation, she's like, "We're engaged." He was like, "Catch you later. Maybe I'll call you." And she had doubled down and was convinced that they were together, even though, and he didn't use the words break or break up or any of that, but it was, like, abundantly clear that he did not want to be with her. But I have found that, okay, there's 2 problems. Men don't wanna be bad guys or wanna be nice guys, so they, like, will do a lot of things to not say they're breaking up. But on the other hand, there's some women who are delusional. So we have some guy who doesn't really quite wanna say that he's done, and a woman who's clinging on to the idea that he didn't say, "We're done." And it just makes for a whole lot of mess. So at this point, he's like, "We can't get together." And he's like, "We broke up." And she's like, "You mean the talk we had a couple of weeks ago?" She's like, "We're good together. We're good for each other. Couples have a bumps in the road. Relationships need work." All the platitudes and stuff that you hear people say. And she says all that to him. And he's like, "You know what? We're really on a break. We're really broken up." And she latches onto the idea that he has an interest in somebody else, and he doesn't deny it. But he just says, "We're not dating." He's like, I gotta go to work." And even though it's a Saturday, and he's like, "Peace out." And Claire says, the last line is, "I was pretty sure I was suddenly single, and Luke was without a father figure again." So, I mean, sadly, she's shopping for this ideal relationship that's gonna, like, sort of make up for what she perceives as mistakes she made in her life, and Miles is declining to fill that space for her. We move on to chapter 16. It is the same day. It's November 15th, 2003, and we're here from Miles' point of view. So he's like, "I hadn't been planning to go to work until he gave that excuse from Claire," but he doesn't wanna, like, be a liar, so he literally goes to work. And, while on his way to work, Lou Valdespino calls, and he is like, "Where have you been?" And Miles is like, It's Saturday." And so Valdespino, when he gets to work, is sitting in his office chair. And it's kind of funny because he's like, "I don't know how," and the FBI, who have a separate at the time, had a separate have separate offices. I think now they're in the same building, but I've been to the FBI office in Cleveland when I was practicing, and it was like its own separate little thing, separate from the federal courthouse, which is its own separate thing. But they built a huge building, and now I think everybody's in the same building. But so Lou is in his chair spinning around. He's like, the guy doesn't have a key. How to get in? And decides not to really ask that question because who does? So Lou is like, I think, he's asking, what has Miles made of the case yet? And other than that one visit with that girl, I think her name was Tracy, Miles hasn't really done a lot. And and Miles asked the question, which is actually the salient question, which is why the county's not prosecuting this. No offense to, like, the delineation between, like, state and federal, but, like, usually like, usually crimes of this nature, corruption, not corruption necessarily, but, like sexual assault and things like that are, like, 95% state prosecutions. They can be federal if you, like, kidnap somebody and take them across state lines, you're, like, trafficking and stuff like that. But to be frank, most cases aren't that complex. They're just, like, on the ground local crime. I mean, there are the, like, people who run, like, a crime syndicate, but they're few and far between and actually don't get prosecuted that often. So he's like, you know, why don't you just, like, do a state prosecution? Why are you the FBI, who is deeply at this point, this is 2003, deeply entrenched in counterterrorism? Why aren't you managing, like, that? And why are you, like, dipped down and, like, this, like, judge who may be, like, abusing people? And he was like, "It's a no-go." He's like, "Nobody is willing to prosecute it." And Miles is like, he has that moment where he's like, "This is gonna be hard." He says, "This case is gonna be full of sad stories that didn't mount to evidence in court, I could tell." That's the highlight, and the note is, "Oh, there's so many cases like this that never get prosecuted," which is true. I mean, and we'll discuss this a little later in the chapter, but prosecutorial discretion is a whole thing. So, so he's like, "What is going on?" And so Lou says, when a single family controls the biggest counties, prosecutors, and the BCI, which is the Bureau of Criminal Investigation for the state of Ohio, and a few hundred litigants, there are always whispers. First, it was from sore losers from elections, people claiming corruption. So basically, there was a whisper network around this judge and this family about corruption. And that is one thing. And corruption is usually like a federal thing, and it's like a deep like it's hard to get people out here to talk about corruption because most likely they were involved, which is how corruption works. So he's like, "That's a no-go." He said, "But they did have a genuine whistleblower who was somebody who had worked for the judge, and she came to the FBI and said, 'I saw the judge exchange favors for a favorable exchange sexual favors for a favorable ruling.'" And Miles is like, "Go with that. Go with that." And he's like Valdespino's like, "Again, the family is deeply entrenched in the politics and the various prosecutors' offices in the state. And even though the Brodies have left, like, the county in terms of prosecutor, the new person, who's actually Lori Pope, won't do that because, like, I mean, look, she just got this job, and we'll deal with Lori Pope a whole lot later, but she just got this job. And the first thing, unless there's, like, some outcry, new prosecutors, the first thing they do is not gun for the previous prosecutor. They gotta, like, mind their P's and Q's for a while. So, at this point, they have a conversation about prosecutorial discretion, and the highlight is so Miles says prosecutorial discretion, right? And Valdespino nodded. Of course, prosecutors didn't go after every defendant that crossed their path. Some weren't worth the time or the money or the aggravation. Some were better off being chased by the feds or being deported by immigration. A good prosecutor saved their time and resources for the worst of the worst and whomever would bolster their reputation. Whether it was low-level drug dealers to prove they were tough on crime or taking down a major kingpin and posing for the cameras with stacks of monies and tons of weapons, each did what they needed to do to prolong their political career. They all came up for re-election and or were gunning for higher office, and public opinion was important. And I'm gonna tell you, like, if you are a prosecutor, clearly you run around saying you're tough on crime. And you usually need some kind of, like, evidence of that. So if you have, like, "I, like, prosecuted, like, 15,000 low-level drug dealers," which was popular, like, in an era, maybe still, but maybe not so much. Then people are like, "Oh, you're tough on crime, I saw you, like, with a swath of people in, handcuffs, or I saw you with the guns and the drugs," and the porn usually. And all of that gives you, like, a tough on crime. Coming to potential voters or citizens, and you're like, "I prosecuted this complex corruption case, and we have, like, rooted out corruption from the county," which doesn't really touch most people, is not sexy and doesn't garner votes. So, with that, like, political background, Valdespino's having a hard time. So, he's like Miles is like, "What do you want me to do?" And because if you're not gonna just arrest the guy for sexual assault, because if in the woman Tracy, like, clearly was not able to consent. So children can't consent, people who've mental disabilities can't consent. There's a lot of people who can't consent to sex. And so it's like what we call like it's a strict liability crime. And since you can't consent, the only order of proof is that um whether or not there was sexual contact. And like it's an easy prosecution. But given the family's prominence, that's not something that Valdespino is willing to do. So he's like, "You've gotta find a federal crime." So Miles is like, "Great." So then he's like Valdespino's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I'm in Title 18." And Title 18 is the crime section of the US code. Previously, he was in Ohio Revised Codes 29, which is the Ohio criminal. And so he's like Valdespino goes to lunch. He's like, "I'll be back." And so Miles, like, didn't go to lunch, and he sees Valdespino, like, rubbing, like, mustard from the corner of his mouth, and he's like, "Okay, well, this guy." And he was like, "Okay, look, I looked in Title 18." He's like, "Maybe Under the Color of Law," which is actually the original title for, Ransomed. But he's like, "Well, what's under color of law?" And it's like, if you deprive a person of their rights under color of law, they're guilty of a federal crime. And he refers to this case from Texas, from 1983 that I actually remember from law school. I don't know what the reason was we learned it. Maybe we learned it from under color of law. Actually, I don't know. But it's this case, and actually it's a thing that happens, unfortunately. So basically, the highlight is a couple of border patrol guards were required 2 women to have sex with them to get into the country. I wondered if this is the case Chaz has been talking about. Damn Claire and everybody else from distracting me from this. Getting Judge Even Brody was moving to the top of my priority list fast. And so Valdespino's like, well, what would have happened if they hadn't like consented to have sex with these guards? And they're like, they would have been turned away. And it's just that if somebody uses their position of authority and deprives people of the right to like not have sex and autonomy, then it is a violation of, the United States criminal laws. How often people get prosecuted for things like that? That's a different question. So they've latched on to sort of a theory of the crime. And then the issue is whether or not Miles is going to like run that up the flagpole, because while the office was interested in it and sort of assigned him to, the issue becomes whether or not it's worth hanging his hat or going out on a limb for these women in order to prosecute this judge. So we move into chapter 17, which is another Miles chapter, but now it's December 18, 2003. So we're like a month and a few days later. Um, and it's Val Despino again, who like he goes to work. He's about to get out of the elevator on his floor, and Val Despino shoves him back in, and he's like, we're gonna go meet somebody." So basically, in the time, Lou found a another victim, and at this point, it's a woman named Kiana who we had met in the first chapter. I think when Claire goes to that first meeting at her job, where she counsels women on the weekends about their children being caught up in the juvenile justice system. And so Kiana, like, now has her child back. They go visit her, and she's like, she is cagey. She is cagey because her the reason her child got caught up in county custody is that her boyfriend at the time, he may still be her boyfriend, that's a whole different conversation, but her boyfriend at the time was like, she calls slinging, but basically selling drugs. And after the tough on crime laws came into effect in the mid to late 90s, one of the things that happened is if one person in a house, especially if they're in public housing, was accused of a crime, they were evicted, and everybody else in in the residence lost their housing, whether or not they were involved in the crime. It's pretty harsh, in my opinion. But that was probably still is, I don't think about this much, but that was the law of the land at the time, and so when her boyfriend was arrested for drug dealing, they were evicted, and because she was, like, temporarily homeless, because eviction does that to you, they took her child. They took her child for 2 reasons. One was that, but the other was that, and this was a thing that happened a lot, children were taken, and it was assumed that if their mother was involved with somebody who was involved in the drug trade, then their mother had put them in a bad situation and therefore was not, like, adequately parenting, which to some extent is true, but to some extent, not every woman knows what every man is involved with. I mean, I have friends who, like, you ask what their dad does, and it's they don't know, and it's especially when their dad, like, runs a business or runs a cash business, and nobody knows what they do, and, it's like the mafia wives, like, at some point, you may have, like, a sense that what they're doing is not on the up and up, but I don't know how it's the responsibility of somebody else to take them out of life of crime or go find somewhere else to live, and all of these things that they assume, like, a good wife or a good mother would do, but there are no social supports for that kind of thing. So they're in her place. She basically admits 2 things, she that the kid is with her ex or with his father, which is probably a violation of the parenting plan or whatever was put into place for her to get her son back. But the other things she admits is that she was able to get her son back by doing a single sexual favor for the judge. And she's a little, I don't wanna say glib about it, but she's like, "It's no different than what other people have asked for her over her lifetime, and it's just the way it is," which is, one of those sad but true things, I guess. So, knowing that, like, Miles is a little more jazzed up, and he says, like, his last line is, uh and, like, this is Kiana, she's like she and I don't know whoever's with her mother, grandmother, some other woman, they share a look, and she said, "Look," she said, "I made sure he signed the papers before I pulled down my pants." And Miles thinks I'd heard bad, worse, and despicable during my years on the force, but I couldn't help shifting in my chair. There appeared to be no end to human depravity. I wanted to get this guy more than I'd ever wanted anything. Valdespino and I locked eyes. This time, his unspoken message was 100% clear. He laid out the evidence. The rest was up to me. So now, like, after a month, Valdespino's like, I know the first, like, he knows about the first witness, and she was, like, a little loosey-goosey because she's incompetent. But the second witness is fully competent, and then it's up to Miles to get this judge. Still doesn't make it any easier. Anyway, we moved on to chapter 18, and we have another Claire chapter. Poor Claire. I feel for her. So in this chapter, the first thing you know is Claire is calling Miles because she is still under the delusion that she can have this man back. And so she calls him and she was like, "Hey, can you come watch my kid?" And he's like, um, why are you calling me?" And she's like, in her head, she like, if she can just get him to play the father and see her in her mother role, then he's gonna, like, come back and wanna be an instant family. But he points out that she has, like, a woman in the neighborhood, Carletta, who watches her son, and that he should do that, and he finally says, "Claire, this has to stop." And he basically says, "It's done." And he's like, "Don't call me ever again." So he finally does the thing that he should have done a bit ago and cuts her off. And it's you know, I'm a little sad for Claire because she really had hope. But she goes to work, and it's at that point where she really clamps down on the women, and she's like, "Look, I have heard rumors that you all are discussing that if you give this judge what he wants, you're gonna get your kid back. That is not how the law works. That is not how the system works. Don't buy into the rumors." So, and the women are like, "You don't know." And she's like, "I do know. I'm an attorney. Don't buy into the rumors." And at the end of the meeting, like, even she sees Kiana, whose kid is out in the car by himself, which is, problematic, but whatever. And she's like, "Is this true?" And Kiana's like, "It is." And she's like, "But you gotta stop saying that because it can't be true." And Kiana's like, "You know what? Believe what you're gonna believe, but, I'm gonna go on about my life." And at the end of that, she gets home and her phone rings. And she's like, Claire's like, "This women are too much." Like she's driving her home trying to figure out like how she's gonna like route this like rumor out of the things and get them on the straight and narrow so they can do what needs to be done to get their kids back. And so she gets home, the phone rings, and she thinks it's Miles, and she's like pretty excited that like maybe they can get back together. And she answers formally because she doesn't want Miles to think that she was sitting by the phone waiting for him. So she's like, "Claire Henshaw." And then the voice says, "Just the woman I wanted to speak with." The old man's voice sounded both familiar and out of context at the same time. Quote, "Judge Eamon Brody here," he said. "In one instant, I knew Rhonda hadn't been lying. I believe we have something in common," he says. So at that point, the stakes are raised. She, in a single instant, realizes that the women probably haven't lied, that she filed this action in court, and then her son is going to be subject to the same system, and that Miles is not coming back. To be frank, that's a lot. So I'm going to end here at the end of chapter 18. We got through 4 chapters today. I'm so proud. And I will say that, like, this what's so interesting about rereading this is that I'm falling in love with this book all over again. I was thinking about it when I was, like, looking at the chapters before I started recording, and I wrote the book in 2009, 2010, more or less. I know there was a start, pregnancy, baby, finish. Um, but my son is 16 now, so that not recently. But I like more about the book than I remember, and I really appreciate the dive into ways in which everybody comes together to try to make this man pay for crimes in a system that is extremely difficult to navigate, especially when the potential defendant has such great privilege. And with that, I will see you. If you like what you see, feel free to like, subscribe, share. If you have hypes, hype the video. And I will talk to you soon with a new episode of The Politics of Justice. This has been Amy Austin.